Hey everyone, it's fizzy here from the attic, and today we're talking about a new update to the micro modules for the voltage modular environment. We are releasing 9 new modules, including 2 very exciting new oscillators, which are unique to the micro module. So definitely want to check those out. And because we have a lot of ground to cover, I think it's best you just get into the voltage modular and check everything out. So let's go. All right. And we're in the VM, so let's talk a little bit about these new micro modules. And let's start off with the easier ones and move our way up to some more exciting new stuff. So let's start off with the trigger sync. Now, trigger sync is a fairly simple module. It has 3 triggers and 1 kind of master trigger. If any signal reaches the triggers or you press the button, it will be armed and waiting for the master trigger to trigger to send out the actual trigger signals. So let's quickly hook it up with some buttons. So we have a button to the first and second trigger. The third one will go to the master trigger. And then we will connect some outputs. Go. So if I put a trigger onto the first, nothing happens, but the little light will light up. And if we trigger the master trigger, we will now have a trigger going out. We could do the same with 2, send triggers to both. And if we send the third trigger, both will send out. So this is quite handy to sync up triggers if there's a small discrepancy between two triggers and you want to make sure everything is synced. This is a great little tool to help out with that. And one use case here would be if you have a long row of modules, it can be a little bit annoying to calculate the exact amount of delay between 2 signals. And if you want to keep things in sync, you can just slap one of these in there and have a master clock trigger the master trigger. So you keep everything nice and aligned. So that's trigger sync. Moving on, we have the trigger humanizer. Now, humanization in this sense is a time variation. So it adds a random time offset based on your settings. And it is a step sequencer, so it will step through the different randomization steps. So at the bottom we have a CV input and output. So let's just hook it up to a clock so we can get a nice steady pulse going. And let's actually sync this. So we should now get a nice row of equally spaced triggers. There we go. Very lovely. And just to make things a little bit more visual, I will add a second so we can actually see the original signal. Now, right now, there isn't that much happening because all the delays are set to 0. And all the randomization is set to 0. So let's actually add a little bit delay to the second trigger. And we should now see a small offset in the top versus the bottom graph. Let's see if we can zoom in a little so we can see this a little bit easier. It's just going to be a little bit hard to see. Let's just really crank that. So you can now more clearly see that every second trigger out of 4 will be moved a little bit. So we'll get a slimmer space between them while the bottom row stays exactly the same. You can set the fixed delay with the top controls. And if you want to add randomization to the time, you can use the control underneath, the random control. This will add randomness to the triggers. Actually, I need to connect them the other way around. So let me just quickly fix that. There we go. So now we get a random change in our bottom row. This is the humanized row versus the fixed row. If we want to reduce the amount of randomness, we can slow down the random speed. With a random speed of 0, it will essentially randomize everything once, and once it is randomized, it will stay basically the same. So there are some small changes now, but nothing too major. But if we really crank up the randomness and we have some random dialed in on every step will change every time it goes through the sequence. So this is a great little tool to add some humanization to sequences, which brings us to the next module. So the next module is the micro probabilistic trigger sequencer, which is really a mouthful. So essentially this is a step sequencer, but every step randomly triggers or doesn't trigger. You can set the chance of something triggering with the controls. So let's just hook up a clock again. So we have a nice little frame of reference, and then we throw on the trigger. With the way it's set up right now, there is a 50% chance of any step happening. So you get a fairly random output. If you want a little bit more control, you can just dial it up. So let's say we put it at 100%. Now every step happens. And if we put step 1 at 0, step 1 will never happen. So you can see one gap appearing every 8 steps. So we get another gap. We should get another gap. There we go. And you can dial this into taste to have some step appear more often than other steps. So you can get a nice little random sequence. Can be very fun for melodies or hi-hat patterns, for instance. Can be fun to have a little bit of randomness there. So that's our probabilistic trigger sequence. Now the next module we can take a look at is the micro utility delay. Now this utility delay is basically a very CPU efficient, very simple delay, really suited for delaying CV signals. It's not made for delaying sound, although no one's going to stop you from trying, but it's not exactly what it's made for. It's very low intensity, so it should be very good at delaying CV signals without using too much of your CPU power. So just to show you what happens, if we dial in a fair bit of delay, a quarter note in this case, if we trigger, you will get a trigger, and a little bit later you will get the second trigger. So you can set it all the way from 1/64, which is basically almost instant, to 4 bars, which means it will take quite a while for the other trigger to happen. We are at a bit of a weird scale, I think. There we go. If you don't want to use it in sync mode, you can of course unsync it. So this is a very nice little delay suited for CV. So it's worth mentioning that this delay will be less suited for continuously modulated signals. It's more suited for instance, triggers or stepped signals. Next step is the scale degree sequencer. So this sequencer is made to generate notes from a scale by random chance. Now the way you dial this in is with these knobs, which show the degrees. So the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and 8th degree. If you set everything at 0, there will be no chance of anything happening. And the nice thing here is if you, for instance, dial in a single degree, you will see that there will be a 100% chance no matter where you set the control. So let's set this to 50 or 0.5. There we go. Now if we dial in another degree, let's say this degree, you will see that the chance drops to 50% of any of these happening. So that's the bracketed number. If we dial in a third one, you will see all the chances update accordingly, so it's very nice. You can set the root node here, just click and drag, and the modes with click and drag. Now if we hook this up to an oscilloscope, which is a little bit odd maybe, but that's a way to visualize what is going on. Let's say we put it at just 100% the tonic. So whenever I trigger it, it will just output this CV. If I were to put it at 100% the second degree, it will just move up, and every time it receives a trigger, it will output just that mode. If you put it at 50-50, it will switch between the two. And this way you can quite easily generate kind of random progressions through scales going from the degrees. This is a great little tool to create randomized node sequences, and we will be using it a little bit later in the demo. This is micro Boolean. This allows you to use Boolean logic in VM. Now the controls on it are fairly simple. We have 2 inputs. You have a threshold. Now the threshold determines how high the signal needs to be considered true. So if you set it as at 0, any signal over 0 will be considered a true signal. If you set it at 0.5 or 2, for instance, you need to have a signal going over 2 to be considered a true signal. Otherwise, it will just be registered as false. Boolean logic, of course, works with true and false, ones and zeros. So this kind of converts your signal into ones and zeros. So you can set at which point it becomes a 1. Anything under the value will be a 0. And then we can use Boolean logic to check whether or not the condition is true. So let's say we input 2 triggers. We can just leave these at 0. Of course, nothing happens. We're set to AND. And if we do a trigger right now, nothing will happen because there's only 1 trigger going in. If we put it to OR, it will trigger at the top or with the second trigger. You also have not AND, in which case it will just output not OR. And exclusive OR. So with exclusive OR, it will once again trigger 1 signal. We can actually demonstrate AND with the trigger sync. So let's say we hook these back up. If we arm both of the triggers and then trigger the trigger sync, we will get an output because there's 2 signals going out. Now the fun thing here is that this module can actually operate at audio rate with the quality switch. This does of course require a bit of CPU, but you can do some pretty crazy stuff with it. For instance, you can do Boolean logic on oscillators. So let's quickly grab an oscillator, and just for the sake of it, let's put it at square. And let's grab 2 of these. And let's make sure they are synced up. There we go. Now we can output them to the Boolean module. Here we go. And we're currently in AND mode, so every time both oscillators are high, we will get a high signal, and every time both oscillators are low, we will get a low signal. Let's zoom this out a little bit. There we go. Now once you start to mess around with the frequency, you can actually see some phase shifting happening. Looks better with the quality on. And this works with any mode. So this allows for some pretty weird noises to be generated. So let's quickly get it in an amp. So that's a lot of fun. We will be using this in a demo a little bit later on. So here we have a LoFi delay. So this kind of started its life as a weird conceptual thought, and it became a thing. It's quite interesting. It's based off the concept of the often used delay chips in actual delay lines for hardware. Now, these chips often have a limited buffer size, and the way you make the delay time longer is by just reducing the sample rate at which you record a signal. So the longer the delay, the lower the quality of the signal in the delay line, because you're reducing the sample rate. And that's what this delay actually does. So once you introduce longer delay times, it will reduce the quality of the delay, and you also have this little degrade knob which controls the sample rate combined with a bitrate knob down here. So let's just start off with a normal delay, so that a eighth, and we're just using a sine wave. Let's make it a little bit less clicky. As you can see, it actually behaves as a analog delay as well. So let's just quickly clean the buffer just by reducing the time by a lot. Let's up the feedback a little bit. And now let's actually start playing with the redux a little bit. So if we have a fairly high feedback, now the thing is, if you use reduction of the quality, so if you emulate the delay line getting longer and thereby reducing the delay quality, if you don't compensate it, you actually make the delays longer. So we made the option to actually do that. If you turn off the compensation and you dial up the redux, the length of the delay will actually become longer. So let's turn off the compensation for a second. Let's leave redux at 0, delay 1 quarter note. It's maybe easy to hear. And now if we dial up the redux, you can hear the delay time becoming quite a fair bit longer. Or shorter, depending on whether you increase or decrease the redux. If you just want the LoFi effect, but you want to have easier control of the delay time, you can turn on the compensation and you don't have to think about that stuff. And this delay really has quite an interesting vibe. If you want to make it even more lo-fi, you can add some jitter, which messes with the sample rate even more. If you max it all the way. almost use it as a as a snare drum. It's pretty extreme. And lowering the bit rate will lower the sound quality as well. And this gets pretty crunchy once you really start to dial up the values, especially in the 1-bit mode. Great for both just normal delay stuff with a little bit of vibe or just straight up sound design. Very cool little delay right there. Now that we've had most of the utilities and facts, I guess it's time to talk a little bit about LFOs. Yes, we have 2 new LFOs which are both pretty interesting and pretty unique. So let's start off with the Bee Swarm Oscillator. So let's hook it up. Let's get some pitch in there. And this is one of those oscillators that really should be used in stereo. So let's hook it up to stereo. I don't think I have to explain why this is called the Bee Swarm Oscillator. So this idea actually came from a little talk I had with Chris, in which he said I wanted to add more modules to micro, but we were running a little bit low on IDs because we already have quite a few of the more standard things, and well, we had to think of some new things. And I was just, I don't know, probably standing in the shower thinking of 3-word acronyms because we have everything shortened to freehand, 3-letter acronyms. And I was probably watching a lot of Beetronic videos at the time when my brain just went, how about micro B? So the name may still change. It's called Bee Swarm Oscillator here. It might become B. I'm going to try to get it to become B. So in my head, it was this thing with all sorts of corny bee puns, like a swarm setting or a hive setting or a queen setting, that sort of thing. It became something a little bit more tame, but the concept is still there. So this oscillator is modeled around a swarm concept. So it's modeled around having several voices in a single oscillator. So the way we have it set up right now, let's just put it down to one voice, no detune. We should get a pretty tame, normal oscillator. Not all that interesting. We can morph the shape of the oscillator a little bit. And it goes from a saw to a sine, so you can make it more or less harsh depending on your flavor of the week. You can add more bees to the swarm. So the default is 0. Let's improve it to 2 voices. And to make things buzz a little bit, you can use the detune control. Now, getting this right was quite tricky because it's very easy to make something sound really, really buzzy, which is great for more of a drone thing, which obviously bees, drones, makes sense. But we also wanted it to be an oscillator you can use in more melodic context. So if you keep the detune fairly low, you can use this as a perfectly normal oscillator. If you move the voices up a little bit, let's go to 4. And we can go all the way up to 8 voices. And the more voices you add, the more chaotic it becomes. And that's pretty cool because you can really, really make it buzz like crazy. So let's make it buzz a little bit. The speed control controls the speed at which the detune of the oscillators happens. So that's the detune parameter is controlled with the speed. And the lower you set the speed, the more pronounced the detune effect is, which you may have noticed. So keep that fairly high if you want to keep it fairly controlled. And with stereo, you can make the swarm go stereo, which sounds pretty amazing. Very nice wide stereo effect. Now, the interesting thing about the bee swarm oscillator is, like I said, it can be a fairly tame, just normal oscillator, but you can also really push it into this insane, buzzy mess of a sound, which is very cool because that gives you a lot of harmonic content to play around with filters. So you can throw some comb filters or some normal filters on there to kind of tame it back to a more controlled sound, but you have all that content to work with. So I think this is really it's something special. It's definitely not for everyone, but just keep in mind if you use this and you find it a little bit too abrasive, just make sure you lower the detune a bit. Don't make the speed too low, and you should still have a very normal oscillator. But also try to really crank it a little bit because it's fun. And And last but not least, we need to talk a little bit about the micro shifting phase oscillator, another new oscillator to the micro environment. And for this we need to get a little bit nerdy, because the concept of phase might not be all that well known to everyone. So I broke out the scope so we can take a little look at it. So right now I'm using two LFOs, both set to sine waves, and they are synced. So as you can see, this LFO1, LFO2. And if you add these LFOs together, all the peaks will amplify each other, and all the valleys will amplify each other as well. So you get a graph that is basically 2 times bigger than it was. And the fun thing of phase is that you can actually shift the peaks of the oscillators. So if we move it to 180 degrees, you will see that now all the peaks and valleys align, and all the valleys and peaks align. And the effect is, if we sum these two things together, we get a flat line, because everything cancels each other out. If you were to move the phase 90 degrees, you will see it moves a bit and it gets amplified a bit, so it changes the shape. Now, doing this with sine waves is kind of boring. It's great for a demonstration, but it's not great from a sound perspective, because you mostly get a sine wave as output or nothing. So that's not all that interesting. So what happens when we start using sawtooths? Right, make sure it's synced. Now let's start off with the phase at 0. And as you can see, the output of the combined sawtooths is twice as high as the input, so that makes sense. But if we start moving things around, you will actually see that the shape of the output is starting to change. So now we have 2 peaks, because this peak lines up with a downward bit, but it's much higher. So you actually get a little spike here, and then you get a sawtooth, and it moves like that. The interesting thing here is, if you move the phase to 180 degrees, you will actually get a sawtooth at the same amplitude, but at twice the frequency. And we can actually hear this if we take 2 oscillators, 2 basic oscillators. We have both set to sawtooths, feed them into a mixer, and if we output this, we get a saw. If we offset the phase to 90 degrees, and to 180, as you can hear, 180, 0, you get a volume difference and a frequency difference. Now, to make this even a little more interesting, you can take 3 oscillators, have them synced, and move the phase around, and that's exactly what's happening with the shifting phase oscillator we made. Let's start with just outputting it. Now we're using 3 LFOs, which are all in phase right now, so that's a lot of gain. As you can see, I really need to clamp the volume down quite a bit, so be careful when loading this in, that you have an amplifier at the ready. We can morph the shape. Saw to square. Of course we can change the pitch to very slow to very high. We have both with modulation if we're in square mode. Very nice parameter to automate. At pure saw this doesn't work, of course. You need some square in there. And then we can offset the phase. So right now everything is in phase, and if we were to move one of the oscillators out of phase, we get that volume drop. And once we start moving the phases around, you get some pretty rich sounds. And the fun thing here is you can actually move things in and out of phase, because we have a CV input. So let's get a micro sine alpha. Let's make sure the speed is rather slow, and let's actually get an attenuator in between. And that's our shifting phase oscillator. So it's a very nice oscillator if you want to get kind of that saw supersaw sound, and you also want to move it around a lot. It's a very easy tool to do this with. And I promised a little teaser, so here's a little teaser of two new effects we're working on. That's the micro chorus and the micro flanger. Now, because we're doing guitar stuff, it's nice to have a little bit of reverb in there. So we also have reverb here at a large area reverb. I will deactivate it for starters, and then we can activate it a little bit later to make it sound even more lush. So here we go. And there we go. A lot of new stuff for the micro modules. I think it's definitely one of those updates where you get a lot of utility, but also a lot of cool new little toys to play around with. So it's a cool update. I hope you enjoy it. And if you have any questions or comments about micro or voltage modular, you can leave them down below. Join the Facebook group or join the Discord, and I will see you.